Good evening. Welcome to another in our series on the book of Acts. I'm going to begin this evening with a reading of Psalm 47. Psalm 47, which reads, "Clap your hands, all peoples. Shout to God with loud songs of joy. For the Lord, the Most High, is to be feared, a great king over all the earth. He subdued peoples under us and nations under our feet. He chose our heritage for us, the pride of Jacob, whom he loves. God has gone up with a shout, the Lord with the sound of the trumpet. Sing praises to God, sing praises. Sing praises to our King, sing praises. For God is the King of all the earth. Sing praises with a psalm. God reigns over the nations. God sits on his holy throne. The princes of the people gather as the people of the God of Abraham. For the shields of the earth belong to God. He is highly exalted." We are in Acts chapter 13. We are not going to power through the entire sermon that Paul is going to preach here in Antioch. So those of you who stretched and brought extra water to class and fastened your seatbelt, we're going to proceed more slowly, more sedately, more sanely, so that I don't you don't get wind burns for the rate of speed through which we go through this class. We will meet, as I mentioned last week at the end of class, we will meet on the 13th and on the 20th. And then we're going to take at least 2 weeks off. The 27th is Memorial Day, and June 3rd, I will be in Cooksville, Tennessee, attending the Worship Leaders Institute boot camp training thing to learn how to lead singing. Well, not to learn how to lead singing. I already lead singing. To learn all the things I do wrong when leading singing. That's not it either. They're going to teach me more about leading singing, I'm sure. And I can report back to you after that. We may have class on June the 10th, depending on how well I can progress in my study of Acts before then. If we don't, I'll send out an email letting you know. If we do, I'll send out an email letting you know. So either way, you will know at some point, just not tonight. So in Acts chapter 13, I'm going to read for you verses 13 to 22, which is what we're going to be covering this evening. Now Paul and his companions set sail from Paphos and came to Perga in Pamphylia, and John left them and returned to Jerusalem. But they went on from Perga and came to Antioch in Pisidia. And on the Sabbath day they went into the synagogue and sat down. After the reading from the law and the prophets, the rulers of the synagogue sent a message to them, saying, "Brothers, if you have any word of encouragement for the people, say it." So Paul stood up and, motioning with his hand, said, "Men of Israel, and you who fear God, listen. The God of this people Israel chose our fathers and made the people great during their stay in the land of Egypt, and with uplifted arm he led them out of it. And for about 40 years he put up with them in the wilderness. And after destroying 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he gave them their land as an inheritance. All this took about 450 years, and after that he gave them judges until Samuel the prophet. Then they asked for a king, and God gave them Saul, the son of Kish, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, for 40 years. And when he had removed him, he raised up David to be their king, of whom he testified and said, "I have found in David, the son of Jesse, a man after my heart, who will do all my will." And we will be stopping there and making some comments and observations off of that verse, but we're going to talk about these other verses as well. So Paul last week was in Cyprus, on the island of Cyprus, and he went to Paphos, which was the imperial capital of the island, where he ran into the Roman proconsul, Sergius Paulus, who wanted to hear the message of the gospel. He had with him as an advisor a Jewish magician And we talked about Elymas, Bar Jesus, whatever you want to call him, and how Paul pronounced a curse on him to blind him for a time. And Paulus, the Roman official, believed the message that Paul had spoken. He was amazed at the teaching. The miracle was impressive, but he was amazed at the teaching. Then the next move that they make is peculiar. It's not the most logical or direct. I mean, they're on an island, so they could go in any direction, I understand, but they go to um, Antioch in Pisidia, which was really in Pamphylia, but they called it Pisidian Antioch anyway. One of the reasons that is put forth for why they make this move instead of going someplace else is that Sergius Paulus had family and a very large estate in Pisidian Antioch. And so, as I mentioned last week, a logical starting point for the apostles in their missionary journey, and this is when Barnabas had the lead when they left from Seleucia in verse 4 of chapter 13. Barnabas takes them over to Crete. They head to, not Crete, they head over to Cyprus because Barnabas is a native of Cyprus. Barnabas has family there, certainly. He has contacts there. He is a known person there. And so it's a logical starting point for the gospel. And then they run into this Roman official who is the first sympathetic Roman official we're going to find in the book of Acts, won't be the last. And he has family elsewhere. He becomes a believer, and it's very possible, maybe even likely, that he urges Paul and Barnabas to take this message that he has heard and share it with his family in Antioch and Pisidia. That's my opinion. You can study these things as you see fit and come up with your own conclusions. But I think it's the next logical step because here in the Roman world now, a door has been opened for the gospel. And Paul, as the apostle to the Gentiles, probably sees this as a golden opportunity. Let's go. Paul has probably sent with him a letter of introduction if he is indeed sending him there, introducing him to his family and saying, hey, you need to listen to what this man has to say because it is a life-changing thing. Perga, we're told they leave Paphos and they come to Perga and Pamphylia. Perga is one of 5 major cities in Pamphylia, but Paul doesn't stop there to preach. He goes on through instead to Antioch and Pisidia. Perhaps it's because there's no real Jewish presence in Perga, at least that people have been able to determine from archaeology. Possibly if he is traveling at Paulus's behest, he wants to make haste to go and share the message and carry out the charge that Paulus has given him, and going to the gospel, going to where there seems, at least at this point, to be a door open to Paul for those who are waiting to hear the gospel message. Some go so far as to suggest that Paul contracted malaria in Perga. And they base that on Galatians chapter 4, verse 13, where Paul is talking to the Galatians and Pisidia being part of Galatia. In Galatians 4, verse 13, this is Ephesians, that's why it's not making sense. Galatians 4. There we go. Brothers, this is verse 12. I entreat you, become as I am, for I also have become as you are. You did me no wrong. You know it was because of a bodily ailment that I first preached the gospel to you at first. And though my condition was a trial to you, you did not scorn or despise me, but received me as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus. Some have suggested that Paul became sick in Perga and he went to the hill country. He goes to Pisidian Antioch, which is 3,600 feet above sea level, where perhaps the air is drier, and he could recover from whatever respiratory distress or whatever illness that he contracted, which dovetails into the next phrase we have in verse 13 of chapter 13 in Acts, that John, that is John Mark, left them and returned to Jerusalem. Now, Luke doesn't give any reason or any explanation as to why John or Mark leaves. Some suggest that he was afraid of catching whatever illness Paul had, and so he left and went home to Jerusalem. It's likely that Mark is a young man, so some suggest that maybe he was homesick for Jerusalem. Some want to give him a good motive and say he went back to Jerusalem to report on the success that they had with the gospel in Cyprus. Some people say that he was afraid. They don't tell us why they think he was afraid. The journey between Perga and Antioch is a difficult one because the Taurus mountain range is in the way, and some of the highest peaks of that mountain range lie on the most direct route. And so maybe he wasn't up to the task. Who knows? Luke does not tell us. The only evidence we have is in Luke chapter 15, verse 38. I'll read verse 37. I'll read verse 36 too. After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are." Now, Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark, but Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And we'll discuss the disagreement that they have over that when we reach chapter 15. But the sense there is that Mark abandoned them for whatever reason. And Paul was deeply offended by John heading back to Jerusalem. Any reason that we can come up with is sheer speculation. And Barnabas, being Barnabas, is going to take Mark with him when they go on this second excuse me, when it goes on this second or this return journey. And in the end, we know that Paul valued Mark greatly because in one of the last letters he writes, he says, "When you come to me, bring Mark because he's useful to me." So whatever issue arose here that John Mark leaves them in Pamphylia, it gets resolved, it gets patched up, and we don't need to know the reason. And I think it's a good thing that we don't know the reason, because being as we are, we might look for said traits in other individuals and examine them with a more jaundiced eye because we're people. And as much as we don't want to be judgy, we're judgy. And Luke isn't giving us that opportunity here, which is a good thing, as I say. So we're told in verse 15 or in verse 14, they went on from Perga and came to Antioch in Pisidia. Pisidian Antioch is 3,600 feet above sea level. It wasn't a huge city, but it served as the Roman administrative center in the Galatian province. It was mostly Gentile, but it had a very well-established Jewish community, a smaller Jewish community, but a very well-established Jewish community that had been there for over 100 years. And so Paul and Barnabas, as is their custom, and just like they did in Salamis in verse 5 of this chapter, they go on the synagogue. They go on the Sabbath to a synagogue and join the congregation there. And because you have Barnabas, who is a Levite, one of the priestly sect within Judaism. You have Saul of Tarsus, who's now going by the name of Paul, but you have Paul there who studied at the feet of Gamaliel, was a rising star within the world of the Pharisees. It's only natural that the elders who oversee the synagogue, who see these out-of-towner guests come into their presence and probably had obtained from them their pedigree, if you will, or their credentials. And uh, here are two honored guests. And so it's not unusual that they would ask them to speak. Often, as people travel, the way news spreads in the Roman world is by word of mouth. You don't have Twitter, you don't have the internet, you don't have phone calls or television. And so when a stranger comes to your congregation, they're bringing news. They bring news of the happenings that are going on beyond your borders. Most of us live very insular and very isolated lives. If we did not have the internet and television and newspapers, we wouldn't know what's going on in the next city over, much less the larger world. Word spreads by word of mouth here. And so they send word to them. They send the leaders send a message to them, or word is passed on to them, saying in verse 15, brothers, if you have any word of encouragement for the people, say it. I like how that's phrased. A word of exhortation, a word to stir up, a word to encourage people. You look in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 13, and Paul uses this same word. When he says to Timothy, until I come, devote yourself to the public reading of Scripture, to exhortation, and to teaching. Do not neglect the gift that you have. Devote yourself to exhortation, to building up. Paul says in Ephesians, this is not in my notes, so I need to find it here. Ephesians 4, verse 29, let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. Our speech should be geared toward building one another up, not tearing one another down. We need to be encouraging one another, where the Hebrew writer tells us in Hebrews 10, the verse 19, therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is his flesh, and since we have a great high priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works. If you look in verses 22, 23, and 24, you have faith, hope, and love mentioned in those three verses that Paul puts together in 1 Corinthians 13 into a very nice, neat package for us. But the idea being stirring one another up, encouraging one another. The entire book of Hebrews is a series of exhortations, as the writer of Hebrews is writing for us, a series of sermons meant to encourage, meant to build up those who hear. And so the leaders, the elders of the synagogue, after the reading of the law and the prophets, they would sing, they would read from the law and prophets, there would be a time for prayer, and then there's a message. Jesus in Luke chapter 3, 4, gives a message in the synagogue in Nazareth. No, it's not 4, it's 3. Now that I've said that, I have to turn back. Please push pause on your audio. Like I said, Luke chapter 4, beginning in verse 16, Jesus visits the synagogue in Nazareth where he grew up, and he's asked to speak. He's given he reads from the scroll of Isaiah, and then he delivers a message. Luke boils it down to he reads a section of Isaiah, and then he says, "Today in your hearing, the scripture has been fulfilled." That's a really short sermon. Certainly, Jesus preached longer. Even here in what we have in this sermon, and we'll talk in a moment about the details of the sermon, even though it's long, it is certainly a shortened version to get the gist of Paul's message. But this is a message, it's meant to stir people, it's meant to provoke a response to the audience. So we have this sermon. The sermon goes from verses 16 to 41, and it breaks down into three sections. We have the introduction that we're looking at this evening, which is commonly understood history between the Jewish audience and the God-fearers who are there. Then we have in verses 23 to 31 is Paul's teaching and instruction about Jesus, which is certainly shortened down from how long Paul probably spoke. And then we have him giving proofs and his exhortation in verses 32 to 41. And we're probably going to spend the next 2 weeks looking at each of those before we hit the break. This is one of three missionary sermons that we have presented of Paul that we have presented in Acts. We have it here in the synagogue in Antioch of Pisidian, chapter 13, verses 16 to 41. The second one you're going to find in Acts 14, verses 15 to 17, to the Lystrans who are assembled outside of the city gates when Paul speaks to them. And the third is in Acts 17, verses 22 to 31, before the Council of Ares in Athens, when Paul gives that message, "Men of Athens, I walked about your city and I saw many idols and many altars and an altar to an unknown God." These are all reduced sermons. Paul delivers his message here, and he begins with the premise that about God's election of Israel, that God chose Israel out of all of the nations of the earth. God chose Israel to be his people and ultimately chose David to be their king. And everybody be nodding their heads at this. The challenging part of the lesson, the new part of the lesson, is when he brings Jesus into it and says that Jesus is the fulfiller of God's promises to David. And therefore, Jesus is the key to Israel's future. And the future Israel, the new Israel, the spiritual Israel going forward, are going to be those who are in submission to God's Messiah. When Jesus speaks in Nazareth, he reads the scroll, he sits down, and he begins to speak. Here, Paul stands up. Paul stands up and he motions with his hands. I don't know if he's going, "Hey, look at me," or if it's simply a, "Hey, pay attention to what I'm about to tell you," because that's how he starts. "Men of Israel, and you who fear God, listen to me. Hear what I have to say." Jesus is giving an exposition of Isaiah 61 when he speaks. Here, Paul is bringing something new, a new teaching. And as such, he's standing in their presence, and you can tell every eye is on him. And I like how he begins this message when he says at the end of verse 16, "Men of Israel, and you who fear God, listen." Two things he's saying there. Men of Israel. First, we have the Jewish body that is there at the synagogue. And then we have those who aren't Jews. And you who fear God. Remember, this is a largely Gentile city. The community of Israel is small. And yet, there are those Gentiles in their midst who have been curious about the Jews, about the Jewish God, who have perhaps heard the teachings about Israel's history and what God did for them through the Exodus and their history through the ages, and they've come to believe. They've come to fear God. Maybe they haven't gone the whole way and become full-on proselytes and been circumcised, but there are Gentiles here. Paul's the apostle to the Gentiles. Here's a logical place to start because here's a sympathetic Gentile audience already built in. And a point here, it has been suggested in numerous biblical scholars and even in ancient Jewish writings that the further one gets geographically from Jerusalem, the more lax one becomes in maintaining rigorous racial purity of the Jews. Here we have a smallish Jewish community, no estimate on the numbers, but it's within a large Gentile community. The world creeps in. Here we have a Jewish synagogue that probably has, and again, I'm reading an awful lot into this text, so please understand that up front as I'm sharing this with you. I'm not getting this from the text. I'm getting this from other studies. We probably have a fairly sizable Gentile audience that is going to hear Paul preaching here. Many times, and even in Jerusalem, in the temple, there was the court of the Gentiles. Gentiles could come. They can't offer sacrifices, but they can come and they can pray at the temple. They can hear teaching at the temple. They can't bring their sacrifices. The Jews there aren't going that far. And in many synagogues, there were places where the Gentiles could stand and listen to what was being taught. They can't sit. But the further away you get, the further away from Jerusalem, the more relaxed the attitude seems to become. Jews who lived in Jerusalem were very suspicious of Jews who lived outside Jerusalem, which is one of the reasons why Jesus is not welcomed in Jerusalem when he comes and he's teaching there, and the Sanhedrin comes to Jesus and asks, by whose authority are you teaching these things? Because they haven't sanctioned him as an authorized teacher. Who has set you up? Who has given you the authority to do this teaching? They're suspicious because Jesus is not pedigreed and he hasn't gone through the school of preaching in Jerusalem. He doesn't have all the right papers and all the right rubber stamps and all the right seals of approval and the blessings from the high priest and the Sanhedrin and whatnot. Boy, when you get hundreds of miles away from Jerusalem, like you are now in Pisidian Antioch, oh, those guys are heretics. Those guys are no. We don't trust those people. They need to come here and be reindoctrinated and take a test. We need to examine them and make sure they're up to snuff. Paul and Barnabas find their start here, that this is the people they go to. But the world creeps in. Does the world creep into our assemblies? Yeah, it does. We make compromises sometimes between what Scripture teaches and what the world urges. And sometimes we might find ourselves relaxing some things. Paul will tell us in Corinthians that to the Jews he became as a Jew, to the Gentiles he became as a Gentile, to the strong he becomes strong, to the weak he becomes weak, he becomes all things to all men, so that by all means he might save some. So there's some validity in taking that approach, but we need to be careful that while we're dealing with the world, we don't let the world overcome us. We're supposed to be the ones overcoming the world, or the message that we have is supposed to be overcoming the world and not letting the world saturate us so that we get drawn away into its idiosyncrasies. But he starts, men of Israel, serving to connect these Jews here back with the Jews in Jerusalem, the larger body of Judaism in Palestine. Sometimes, if you are within your own congregation, sometimes you can feel sort of cut off from the rest of the world or the rest of the church at large. And I think that's more prevalent in a smaller congregation, like Rome is a small congregation. And sometimes you might feel a sense of disconnection between your small group and the larger church throughout New York State, or the larger church within the world. Because we, like I said, we're insular. We get isolated to our own little group. And, I trust the brethren from Albany. I trust the brethren from Rome because I worship there. Those guys over there in Liverpool, though. And David Owens is a dear, dear friend of mine. He's the preacher there, so I trust him. But it's at the same time, I don't know what's going on in their congregation. I know more than I want to know about what's going on in Albany, and I know what's going on in Rome. But outside of those borders, who knows? Who knows? So these guys are hungry. This synagogue, this long looping way around to reintroduce the sermon here. The synagogue leaders are eager to hear whatever it is that Paul has to say. And so he stands up and he addresses them saying, men of Israel. And then he goes through this lesson, this introduction, sharing their shared history as a demonstration of God's faithfulness. That's really the underlying theme of the entire thing. In verse 17, he says that God chose the patriarchs. God, the God of this people of Israel, chose our fathers. What was it that was so special about Abraham that God picked him out of all the other people in the world to be the father of the Hebrews? Well, if you ever discover it, please do tell me, because I'd like to know. God doesn't tell us. All right. Why did God choose Mike Hebert? I don't know. God didn't tell me. God's chosen everybody. Not everybody chooses God. I understand that. But those whom he foreknew, he chose to be his children. He chose all of us. But God chose. Here's the initiative of God. God chose the patriarchs. He is with Israel in Egypt and during the Exodus. God multiplied the people. He saved the people. This is in verse 17, that he was there. He made them great during their stay in Egypt, and then with an uplifted arm, he led them out of it. In the wilderness wandering, he puts up with them, or he nurtures them. We'll talk about that in just a moment. In the wilderness, he gives them the land of Canaan, verses 19 to 20. When they asked for a king, or rather, he gives them judges. They don't want the judges anymore. They asked for a king. God gave them what they asked for. Didn't work out quite so well for them. And then God chose for them David to be their king. And it's through David that the seed promise for the Messiah will come about, through the seed of David. In what Paul says here, we find an echo of the sermon that Stephen preached in Acts chapter 7, beginning in verse 1 down through verse about 50, before he turns on his audience and makes an accusation against them. But it's interesting because Paul was present when Stephen preached his sermon, and Stephen did the same thing. He started back with shared history. He goes back to um, Abraham, and then he goes to Joseph, and he goes to Moses. And shared history that the Jews would understand. And so Paul uses that as his beginning too. I don't know if the words of Stephen were echoing in his head as he was speaking, but he makes some interesting comments here. In verse 17, he says that God, with uplifted arm, led them out. That's an interesting turn of phrase, the uplifted arm. Look at Exodus chapter 6, verses 1 and 6. We'll look at a couple other verses too that use this same sort of terminology. Exodus, not 5, Exodus 6, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. For with a strong hand he will send them out, and with a strong hand he will drive them out of this land. And then in verse 6, they say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from the slavery to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. Deuteronomy 4, verse 34. Uh, Verse 32, now ask of the days that were past, which were before you, since the day that God created man on the earth, and asked from one end of heaven to the other, whether such a great thing as this has ever happened or was ever heard of. Did any people ever hear the voice of a God speaking out of the midst of the fire, as you have heard, and still live? Or has any God ever attempted to go and take a nation for himself from the midst of another nation by trials and signs, by wonders and by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, by great deeds of terror, all of which the Lord did for you in Egypt before your eyes? In Isaiah, it's written that the arm of the Lord is not shortened, that he cannot save. The arm of God represents his might, represents his power. If you're right-handed, your right arm is your strong arm, and it's the arm of power. This is with God when he raises up his hand to rescue his people, he will deliver them. And then he says in verse 18, and for about 40 years he put up with them in the wilderness. Now you might have a footnote there. I'm reading from the English Standard Version. My Bible has a footnote. It's number 3 if you're curious. It says some manuscripts say he carried. Compare Deuteronomy 1, verse 31, and we will go there in just a moment. Bruce Metzger, in his extremely helpful textual commentary on the Greek New Testament, makes a comparison of the text between he bore with them or he cared for them. The difference is a single Greek letter. It may be that some scribe in copying the text got lazy and left one of the phi. I think that's, yeah, the letter phi. He may have left one of those out of the word. It's a single letter, but it makes the difference between put up with or carry. If you look at Deuteronomy 1, verse 31, and it reads, and in the wilderness you have seen how the Lord your God carried you, as a man carries his son, all the way that you went until you came to this place. They're at the banks of the River Jordan, are about to cross into the land of Canaan. If you look at Deuteronomy 32 and verse 10, the same thing is said again toward the end of the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 32, verse 10, he found him in the desert, in a howling waste in the wilderness. He encircled him. He cared for him and kept him as the apple of his eye. God's care for Israel. Psalm 28, verse 9. Which says, "O save your people and bless your heritage. be their shepherd and carry them forever. As I said, the difference is one Greek letter, and the sense of what Paul is saying is either that God faithfully sustained them. He gave them manna, he gave them quail, he guided them with the cloud or the pillar, he defeated their enemies before them. In other words, he carried them through the wilderness. Or he tolerated them. He had to put up with them. Look at Acts chapter, or not Acts, Psalm. Wow. Psalm chapter 95 and verse 10. Very strong language here. Where God says, "For 40 years I loathed that generation and said, they are a people who go astray in their heart and have not known my ways." So you have that sense too. When I was at Northeast School of Biblical Studies and I was studying textual criticism with Steve Singleton, he said that when you come to a text that has two ways it can be read, one a difficult way and one an easy way, always go with the difficult way. The reason for that is if I get a letter from Bill Moore and in it there's a sentence that is kind of, his handwriting isn't as clear as I might like it to be, and it could be read one way, it could be read another way. If you are correcting a text by changing it, you don't correct it in such a way as to make it more difficult to understand. You correct it in a way to make it easier to understand. And so if the text here is easier to understand by reading that God for 40 years carried or cared for the people in the wilderness, and it's more difficult to say that God put up with them in the wilderness than maybe put up with is the original sense. I don't know. I'm just presenting both of them to you. I'll let you make your decision. Does God still put up with us today? Well, yes, he does, because God is merciful. He is slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. That's in Exodus 34. Verse 6, the Lord passed before Moses and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the father on children and the children's children. Well, if he's forgiving sin, then why is he visiting iniquity on the children? There's a difference. There are those who sin unintentionally, and then there are those who sin with a high hand raised to God, saying, I'm going to do what I want to do. We've all been guilty of those sins. I'm going to do what I want to do, says 4-year-old me, going off of Jack's lesson at the Wednesday dinner in Devo. Having the tantrum and saying, I want my childish way, and I'm going to do it. So there, stick my tongue out at God. God does not break out his divine 2x4 and whack me over the head with it. He puts up with it. And hopefully I come to my senses and I repent and I ask for forgiveness, because God is faithful to forgive. Paul says that in verse 20, that the time that they were in Egypt and the time they are wandering in the wilderness and the time they destroy the nations of Canaan took about 450 years. And that's approximately right. That's a fairly decent estimate. They were 400 years, give or take, in Egypt, and they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years and 10-ish years taking the land of Canaan. But he says after that, in verse 22, after he removes Saul from being king, he makes 3 statements. I have found David. Psalm 89, verses 19 and 20. Psalm 89. Verse 19 and 20, of old you spoke in a vision unto your godly one and said, I have granted help to one who is mighty. I have exalted one chosen from the people. I have found David, my servant. With him, with my holy oil, I have anointed him, so that my hand shall be established with him. My arm also, here's the arm again, shall strengthen him, and the enemy shall not outwit him, and that wicked shall not humble him. God found and chose David. David wasn't the most kingly looking king. He was a handsome young man. Saul was the one who looked kingly. He was taller by a head than anybody else. God says, I found David, a man after God's own heart. 1 Samuel 13 and verse 14. 2 Samuel, that's why it doesn't make any sense. Wow. 1 Samuel 13, verse 14. Now your kingdom, this is Samuel speaking to Saul, shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord has commanded. And if you remember when Samuel anoints David to be king over Israel in 1 Samuel 16, he goes to the house of Jesse and he makes Jesse's sons pass before him, and the firstborn comes, Eliab, in 1 Samuel 16, verse 6. When they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. The Lord looks on the outward appearance, but the man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Who will do all my will. That's a strong statement there, too. Isaiah 44. Isaiah 44, verse 28. I love this verse. God says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall fulfill all my purpose, saying of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and of the temple your foundation shall be laid. Cyrus is a Persian. At the time of this writing, he hasn't been born. He won't be born for quite a while yet. But God has already appointed Cyrus, king of Persia, to be his shepherd, one who is going to do the will of God entirely unwittingly. If you remember Carrie's sermon yesterday, those of you who were in Rome or who have seen the video on either YouTube or on Facebook, Carrie made the point that God is going to accomplish his purpose. Whether or not I choose to be part of that accomplishing of his purpose is my choice. God will get done what he's setting out to get done. He gets things done through Cyrus of Persia. Jesus says in John chapter 8, verse 29, another challenging thing. And it's not John 8, verse 29. Somewhere in John, darn it. I thought I had the right passage. That I do, oh, it is verse 29. I have to read the whole verse. And he who sent me is with me. He has not left me alone, for I always do the things that are pleasing to him. I always do the things that are pleasing to God. So I look at the statement here. I have found in David a man after my own heart who will do all my will. Can I put my name in David's place? Is anyone comfortable with putting your name in David's place? I have found in Peter Archibald a man after my own heart who will do all my will. So how much of God's will do I need to do in order for that to be said of me? It's 80% acceptable? Should I shoot for 80% of doing God's will? No, you know that's a ridiculous thing. How many wives are going to be happy with husbands who are 80% faithful to them? 80% isn't going to cut it. Jesus sets the bar really, really high when he says, I do always the things that are pleasing to God. I did not do everything that my parents wanted me to do. They did not disown me as their child. They may have wanted to sell me to the gypsies a time or two, but they didn't do that. My children didn't do everything that I wanted them to do. They're still my children. I've not done everything that my wife would like me to do, but we are still husband and wife and have a good marriage. I'm not trying to lower the bar, understand? Because none of those are a valid way to measure my performance with God, I don't think. Jesus says in John 15, verse 1, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. John writes in 1 John chapter 2, verse 6, whoever says he abides in him ought to walk in the same way in which he walked. So let me ask you a question. Does God understand that we are going to sin? Do you think he factors that in when he selects me for a particular ministry? Does he account for my weaknesses and the fact that I am not going to do it perfectly? Let me use this class as an example. I'm an imperfect teacher. I've just taught a Bible class. It wasn't a perfect Bible class. It was not the best Bible class that you have ever sat through. And if you say it was, I know you're not telling the truth. You could have had a significantly better teacher than me to present this material. But God used me because this is part of what I do for God. If I have a hammer that has a face that is slightly askew, so that it doesn't strike straight when I'm swinging it, I can still use it to drive a nail. I just need to make an adjustment with my grip. I'm an imperfect tool in God's hand. He has to do an awful lot of adjusting of his grip to use me. Look at 1 John chapter 3, one of my favorite verses in the New Testament. 1 John chapter 3, verse 19 says, by this we shall know that we are of the truth and reassure our hearts before him. For whenever our heart condemns us, God is greater than our heart, and he knows all things. Beloved, if our heart does not condemn us, we have confidence before God. But when our heart condemns us, when I fail God, David, man after God's own heart, failed God. He didn't always do everything that God would have had him do. And yet God says of him, here's a man after my own heart. I would hope that it can be said that we are people after God's own heart, that we desire to do all of the will of God, recognizing that we're going to let him down. We are going to fail at points in our walk with God. God does not rub our noses in our failures. Instead, he celebrates our successes. You have the scene in Matthew 25, and I go to it often, Matthew 25, verses 31 and following, when the angels divide the people as the shepherd separates the sheep and the goats. He says to those on his right, I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me a drink. I was naked, you gave me clothing. He doesn't say on Monday, May 6th, 2024, you guys let me down. Remember what it says in Jeremiah of the new covenant? I will forgive their iniquities, and I will remember them no more. Meaning God isn't going to drudge it up and throw it in my face. Am I doing all the will of God perfectly? No. Am I doing all the will of God that I know how to do to the best of my ability? Let me put another caveat on there. When 4-year-old me doesn't say no, uh, and I submit in obedience, yes, I'm doing all of the will of God that he knew in advance that I would do. Wrap your head around that one for a bit. God's foreknowledge. He knows when I'm going to have that stubborn fit and do what I want to do. He knows when I'm going to fail him. He uses me anyways to accomplish his will somehow in some small way. David failed, just like every other human being to live, save for Jesus failed. God still gets his purpose is accomplished. Look at the apostles. During the ministry of Jesus, what was their favorite topic of discussion? I am the greatest. And John would say, no, you aren't, Peter. I'm the greatest. And Judas would say, you're all full of hogwash. I'm the greatest. Only Judas wasn't. Somehow, God managed to build his church using those men. So my question that I'll leave you with is, what can he do with you if you let him work through you?